Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and I am, as always, joined by Anthony Tresca.
Hey there!
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited and very, very thankful to have you join us for our episode over the 1984 classic A Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yay! This is going to be a terribly exciting and fun episode, in part because of just how much you and I really appreciate and love the original Nightmare on Elm Street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is my favorite horror movie, and it's also the first horror movie that I really remember seeing. So I mean, like, I remember I saw it at a late night screening at like one of the anniversary screenings of it, and I didn't really think. I mean, first of all, when my parents took me, they did not tell me it was a horror movie, so I didn't really know what I was getting into. I didn't really know what the movie was, but I was just like, it's the anniversary screening. I'm sure if it's getting an anniversary screening, people must like it. It must be somewhat good. And I just remember seeing it with that rowdy crowd, and it was just amazing.
Do you remember how old you were?
Oh, I don't remember how old I was. Must have been like around somewhere between like 10 and 12 when I saw it.
That's interesting that, not that like, that's not about the right age to see the film, but like, it's interesting that your parents like chose that as your first horror film, like chose to take you to it, chose to take you to the like chaos that is a showing of a beloved film. Like, it's just so interesting that I love it so much.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what was going through my parents' head to like justify that, to justify taking me to see A Nightmare on Elm Street, but I am glad they did, because again, like I said, it was I saw that then, I loved it, but then I really didn't see much horror or like do anything with that love. I was just like, well, I like that one's good, until like 2017 when the It movie came out, and I was like, oh, I guess I will watch more of this show. Will watch / read / partake in this genre more. But yeah, I love this movie, and I've always loved the whole Nightmare on Elm Street genre, because that was the exception too. I didn't watch very much horror for most of my childhood, except for the Nightmare on Elm Street series. I watched all of them.
And it makes sense, right, for you, because one, it's all about the camp, right, and you were all about the camp, and two, there's, that I bet you that first viewing, right, had left this indelible print, because you are about theatrical experiences, right, and those anniversary screenings of things where everyone knows all the lines and is, saying them together. I mean, it is as much of a theater experience as you can get that's not live actors, right?
Yeah, I know that my dad in particular loves this movie, and so when I was a child, I would go to like comic book conventions and whatnot, and I actually went and sat in on a Nightmare on Elm Street panel with my dad, where we just listened to the entire original cast, except for, I think it was either the mother or the father, just talk about the experience of the making of A Nightmare on Elm Street. So like, I was a super fan of this.
Yeah, that's so exciting. I would, I have to be really hard pressed, as in like maybe the life of a loved one is at stake, for me to be able to effectively list favorites of anything. That's just a failing of mine. So I don't think I could ever say this is my favorite horror film of all time, because that makes me feel real anxious, but I can definitely say that it's probably my favorite horror comedy. I can say that and still feel like I don't have to limit myself to an answer that no one really cares if I'm locked into.
For me, it's a little easier for me to say favorite, because I'm saying like favorite in the sense of like I have a whole story attached to it, so it's a little
Yeah.
easier. It's because people are like, oh, they probably don't necessarily mean like that. Favorite doesn't necessarily mean best, or like this is the best movie of all time. It just means like this is like the horror movie that started it all.
Yeah, and you know, you would think that maybe it's because like as a horror scholar I can't claim a favorite, but like I just can't do that about anything. It makes me really anxious. But I can say that one of the things that will make me love this film perhaps more than many a film is the fact that the production began on the day that I was born, right? June 11, 1984. And, you know, that speaks to a connection that was created by the cosmos, even if the first time I saw it does not have nearly as adorable of a story as you have. So I think what we should do is talk about what we appreciate about this film, what scholars have kind of used this film to explore, and where we think this film fits within sort of our larger discussion of horror comedy and things like that. So what's interesting to me about this film is that there is so much scholarship on this film in particular, but also on the franchise. And it surprises me not because it's not a film worthy of such criticism or scholarship, but more because, as we saw with our discussion of Evil Dead, even some of the big franchises just don't have a lot of scholarship, right? Because that's just not really where our field has gone. Most people are looking at more like themes as opposed to sort of in-depth analyses of one specific film. But what's fascinating about looking at the scholarship on Nightmare is that it is really wide-ranging, and that to me speaks to a good text, right? When you can have multiple sort of ways of examining that. And I will say straight up front, I am pretty sure I do not agree with all of the scholarship that is out there. And the one I'm thinking of particularly is shout out to David Kingsley, who wrote an article about where he made this argument about how Elm Street can be read as this Gothic text. That I 100% agree with.
I was like, that's not like a super hot take.
Yeah. Bernice Murphy, who is an amazing horror scholar, talks about the suburban nightmare in American, right, in America's suburban Gothic narrative. So yes, this is a keen example of this. Where I am a little less sure that I can agree with Kingsley, though, is that he uses some of the tropes of the Gothic narrative, particularly that of like the doppelganger, to talk about how the film can be read as this incest narrative in which Krueger becomes a doppelganger figure for the father figure. And what I like about Kingsley's argument is that he definitely supports his claims, right? He shows clear examples of, for example, the scene where we have Krueger like defeating the mother in the bed, right? And we have a lot of moments where, the paternal neglect is immediately followed by the unacceptable degree of interest from Freddy in terms of Nancy.
And I mean, also, Freddy and the father never share the screen together.
Exactly.
It's a compelling argument, but just sometimes you're like, did you have to include so much Freudian analysis? Did you?
Yeah, I think that's what it is, right? Is you're absolutely correct. It's a very compelling argument, and it's one that I'm like, you know what? That's interesting. I'm almost willing to go there, except I really don't want to because I don't want to go Freudian, and I'm really okay with not having one of my favorite horror films be about incest, right? Like, I'm just, as I've said before on the series, I'm just not, I don't need incest. Like, I don't need that as part of my horror experience.
Wow, coming out strong with
just
the
coming
hot
out
take
with
against incest.
Yes, against incest horror. I can do without it for the rest of my life, and it will still be much too soon. So, we have cases like that, and then we also have people like Jonathan Markovitz, who argues and explores how the series, and more specifically just sort of horror broadly, depicts this issue of female paranoia and explores whether or not this is a reasonable thing to employ as a survival skill, or if it's more of a like pathological or problematic misplaced paranoia, right? And so female paranoia is that idea that, you know, as a woman, you're just a little bit more aware because you've been told to be more aware about looking behind you, and making sure, you know, women are told very explicitly all the things they have to do to make sure that they don't get attacked, in a way that I don't remember, like in elementary school, the male students being told.
I believe if we want to get Freudian, Freud called it hysteria.
Yes. And right there, right, thank you for that sound of disgust, because there inherently is the problem. And so what Markovitz does is he kind of goes through and shows the way that Nancy's paranoia becomes a survival skill, right? It's because she's saying, hey, something's not right, when everyone's else like, yeah, it is, it's okay. That does lead to her survival. But he ends by saying that the problem is that a lot of films, Nightmare included, because of the way they conclude and because of with that little, like, twist ending at the end, right? It's a little hard to say whether or not the film is more feminist or more misogynist, and the result is that we see that in horror, sort of acknowledging the power of women and employing their paranoia as a survival skill comes in moments, not as a sort of generic trope that we can accept yet. And I think that's a great argument to make, because it speaks to the power of Nightmare, and this is a weird power to have, but Nightmare manages to be a sometimes contradictory text, and I think that actually is one of its greatest strengths.
Yeah.
Is that it has so many layers, and yes, all the layers don't quite fit together, but it allows for so many interpretations and understandings of the film.
This film definitely steers closer to 1981's Evil Dead than it does like a more typical slasher like Halloween or Friday the 13th. It's far more in line with, like, we concluded about, like, Evil Dead, that it's neither affirmative horror nor disaffirmative horror, because it affirms nothing and disaffirms nothing. It's just chaos. Whereas, like, Friday the 13th and Halloween are both clearly affirmative texts. There's, like, ways to survive in that universe. If you just, like, if you were just a good person by, like, what our puritanical society deems as, like, good moral values, you can survive those movies. Whereas Nightmare on Elm Street, and this is introducing a larger topic of conversation that we will keep coming back to throughout this episode, it is not an affirmative text. It is, I think, quite clearly a disaffirmative text. That's different than a lot of comedy, particular horror comedies that we talked about on the podcast.
Yeah, so there's several things that you talked about that were like golden moments. And the first is that I love your comparison to Evil Dead, because in our discussion of the remake of Evil Dead, we talked about one of the problems of that remake was that it had tried to, like, sand off all the rough edges that make the original film so delightful, right? Something that you can, like, hold on to. And I think you're right that that's a similar thing with Nightmare, is that Nightmare has all these rough edges, and it's that actually makes it delightful. So I'm so glad you made that comparison. But you're right. Okay, so affirmative versus disaffirmative, as we've talked about in other episodes, but if this is your first listen, really comes from concepts developed by Linda Holland Toll, and she says that in affirmative horror, it's sort of this cathartic experience where we are temporarily allowed to let off steam by encountering this monster creature outside force, but at the end of the day, when we vanquish that, we're like, oh good, the evil threat, which was external, has been destroyed, so now we can return back to the goodness that is society. Whereas disaffirmative horror is saying that hey, when you lift up that sheet and you look at the corpse underneath, it's going to have our face, because we are the problem, we are the monster. We can't ignore that what has created the horror are the ideologies, and then the policies built on those ideologies that shape who we are. And you're right that comedy is by itself almost exclusively going to be affirmative. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, most comedy is meant to be, like, trifling entertainment. And so, I mean, if you are to be entertained, you probably don't want to have all of your values that you hold dear constantly questioned. So you might have them challenged a little bit, and you might have to slightly change your view, but why would a comedy, if the whole purpose is to, like, just entertain and just, like, basically, I mean, make you laugh, why would it try to tell you at the very end that, like, oh, and all of those things that we pointed out and, like, you laughed at, those are all horribly bad. Like, if you are even remotely like that, you're part of the problem. No, that's not, like, that's probably not going to sell a lot of tickets if you're, like, making just a standard comedy.
No, it's not. And I think that even if we go back to even beyond, like, just issues of like, entertainment and selling, that sort of side of the business, a happy ending, we have been taught, back to mythology, right? Not just like fairy tales, but mythology is you doing the things that everyone else is doing, the normative behaviors, and being rewarded for them.
I mean,
right?
yeah, most comedies are morality tales. If you just, like, I mean, that's not what they call themselves, obviously.
Right.
And sometimes the subject matters featured in comedies are obviously not always the most moral. But if you boil it down, like, the standard fare of comedies, like, generally is, like, you start from a place where your things are good, things become not so good in the middle due to, like, either moral failure or just, like, situational failures, etc., etc. You have to learn a lesson, and then by the end, everything works out. And that's a morality tale.
Right. And on the surface, a good chunk of Nightmare can be read that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the teens who die in the film are still the teens that, quote, deserve to die. They're the ones that are being promiscuous. They're the ones that are playing with drugs and alcohol. And even Nancy's boyfriend, played by, of course, Johnny Depp.
In his feature film debut.
Excellent, right? Which, what more could you ask for from a film than seeing Johnny Depp for the first time? He has failed her, right? Like, he made a commitment to her, and he broke his promise. And so he has to pay, right? And Nancy's mom, who his character drives me batty, she has to be punished because she's drinking like a fish. And
she got a divorce.
And she got a divorce, heaven forbid. And, so she's not being a good mother. She's not being a good wife. Of course she's going to have to burn to a fiery death in her bed. So on the surface, there's a lot of this film that seems to be supporting this idea that, this being a good member in society is something that you should strive for. And if you are not doing it, you're going to be punished because society, as we have it constructed, is good, right? But obviously, this film does not entirely do that.
No, I mean, I don't think it can, because there's a lot of, like, questionable morals. Like, it raises a lot of really uncomfortable things that, because, I mean, the whole crutch of the film, you realize, is, like, the reason this Freddy Krueger character exists is because a group of parents decided to get together to enact civilian justice in their minds and just, like, burn this guy alive. Which is, I mean, some people might be like, that's justified, and I don't know if I necessarily disagree, but it's certainly outside the realms of, like, standard morals. I mean, you do murder someone, like, even if they are a monster, like, that is still murder. You don't get to, like, wash your hands of that easily, which is what the film tells you, and is showing you over and over again. And so, I mean, I think it's only natural that...
So it's interesting, right? Because you just said, like, pointed to what seems like a contradiction, right? Which is that the film at its heart has this idea of vigilante justice. And we see the parents being punished for this vigilante justice, right? The mom gets punished by, again, the fiery death. But all the other parents are being punished by having their kid killed. But at the same time, the film doesn't, I don't think, entirely condemn it, because we watch Nancy, our final girl, trying to also kill Krueger, and we have been taught in slasher films, right, that there is a individual who has the, like, right from heaven to destroy the evil, right? And that's our final girl, our slayer, whomever that might be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for a slasher film to make you question murder and death so much, because I think a lot of times the whole point of these slasher films is like, oh my god, they're so grotesque and over the top, so we don't even really think about like the loss of human life. But this film, I mean, and like I think that's important to remember, but this film like really acutely reminds you that it is the taking of human life. Just about every single time it does it too. It's like, it really reminds you, even though it is presented in an outrageous, over-the-top manner.
Yes. Yeah, you can't you can't think about the deaths and not think about the sheer amount of, like, fake blood that's used. And you have a fact about that, right?
I do. So do you wanna take a guess at how many gallons of fake blood were used for special effects during the production?
Yes, and I'm gonna be like way off, I know, probably overguess, but I'm gonna guess 150 gallons.
You thought you were gonna overguess.
Ooh, yay! Did I underguess? I'm so excited.
Way under. It's actually 500 gallons of fake blood were used for special effects during the production. Yeah, it's a lot of fake blood.
So, for those of you that, are having difficulties imagining how much 500 gallons is, I Googled, like, how big is a 500-gallon aquarium? And so that would be an 8-foot long by 4 feet tall aquarium, right? I mean, so we're talking over that you could completely submerge a human in that much blood, and you still would have probably, like, a lot of space. It would be very roomy. Yeah, it would be extremely roomy. Yeah, so like, that's insane. So 500 gallons of fake blood is used. So again, we go to what I think makes Nightmare so fascinating, and that is it is a contradiction. So on the one hand, it has these, like you said, over-the-top ridiculous deaths. I mean, we have the scene where blood looks like it's, just gushing out of the bed. But on the other hand, you're right, that compared to, especially compared to, I think it's two sort of compatriots, Halloween and Friday the 13th, there's an uncomfortableness in the deaths of Nightmare because it feels like we should be able to stop it, right? Like, Nancy doesn't make it in time to save Rod, but like we have to watch really uncomfortably the scene where he's gonna be hung. We know that Johnny Depp's character, whose name I can never remember, is... Yeah, I mean, it's Johnny Depp, right? Like, we know that, like, he's gonna die because he's fallen asleep, but, like, we're constantly, it's hard to not, like, say, hey, come on. And same with our first death, Tina, right? So I think you're correct that this film doesn't let us sit comfortably with death. Yeah,
and, I mean, that doesn't sound like it should be, like, super revolutionary, because... No. I mean, aren't you supposed to always feel bad when people die? I mean, just in comparison, like, it's inevitable that we talk about, like, Friday the 13th and Halloween, because they all came out around the same time and are all kind of, like, viewed as the origins of the slasher, even if that's not necessarily true. If you want more information on that, I would recommend going back and listening to our episode over 1974's A Black Christmas, which I believe is the first true slasher. But in, like, those other two films, Halloween and Friday the 13th, you don't really feel that bad when people die, because the film is saying they kind of deserved it.
Yeah, they kind of deserved it, or even if they didn't, they're just a casualty, but society will still survive, right? Mm-hmm. Like you don't feel their loss in any meaningful way. Right. And while we link them together, I think it is important to remember that there is, like, there's a 10-year difference between Black Christmas and Nightmare, but there's going to be, like, 6 years and then about 4 years for Halloween and Friday, respectively. So that I think that drives further home your point that, like, by the time we get to Nightmare, there's kind of this established thing of like, well, the teens have to die, and that no one had questioned until we get to Nightmare.
Yeah, and which is why Nightmare is so much more interesting. And I think I think a more appropriate comparison is not what it typically gets compared to, which is Halloween, Friday the 13th. It's lumped in with like standard slasher fare. I think the far more appropriate comparison is something like Evil Dead. Goes to the opposite extremes, in which you are not meant to care about the deaths. It doesn't matter because society doesn't matter. It doesn't matter one way or another whether these people live or die, because it doesn't. Nothing matters. It's a nihilistic existential nightmare. And I think Nightmare on Elm Street is far more akin to something like that than the conservative affirmative horror that is Halloween and Friday the 13th.
So if we were a Sesame Street episode, I think that our word of the day would need to be liminal, because to me, that's the word that links the Evil Dead franchise, but especially the first film and Nightmare, is that so much of Nightmare is in the space between spaces. So I always think about, when I think about liminal, I very explicitly think about like a doorway, and how technically when you're in a doorway for a brief second, you're not in either room, right? But you're also sort of simultaneously in both. It's like a sort of Schrodinger's cat type thing. And so, yeah, I think you're right that what makes Nightmare more akin to something like Evil Dead is the fact that this film cannot easily be categorized in the same ways that the Evil Dead can't easily be categorized. And I think one of the most impactful scenes for me that really brings this home is the way that, I mean, it's through the use of the dreamscape, right? So I think about the scene, the very disturbing scene, where Nancy's mother's like, "Come here, Nancy, I want to show you something," and then takes out of the furnace, right, the knives for fingers, his little hand glove thing, and it's like, whoa, lady, that is an intense thing to be keeping in your house. But later in the film, there's this beautiful scene where Nancy's transitions, as one does in a dream, from her basement to the boiler room and Freddy's lair. And in the process, what that scene is doing is it's showing us like, what is the place we should be afraid of, right? Is it this fantastical, otherworldly place? Yes. Or is it suburbia and the things that we keep buried within society? Yes, right? Like, and the ability just in that one scene to articulate the fact that we should be afraid of both these monsters that are not created by society, right? Because the film never tries to imply that Krueger is a pedophile because society made him one. Never once does it try to do that. So it sets him up as a monster that is outside what is acceptable. But at the same time, the threat that Nancy and friends are facing is 100% created by a society in which a group of middle-class white people can get away with murdering someone, even if that someone is a pedophile. And to me, that is an amazing feat for a film that is not that long, and not that complex in terms of like dialogue or things like that.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right. And I honestly think it's kind of just because of the nature of the film itself. It's one of those things that I think often gets overlooked about like the absurdist genre or camp or things like that, is that like usually these genres they're used to show us, to like peel back layers, to be like, we're gonna oversimplify this and we're gonna like present you with something that on the surface seems really this one thing, like it's this one way. This is because I mean, on the surface it kind of, I genuinely could see how someone interprets this as being like an affirmative horror text that is very, very akin to like Halloween and Friday the 13th, in which the bad people are punished and the good people, I mean, Nancy is mostly successful.
Yeah, I think the twist ending makes it a little hard, but not that hard, right? Like, I think you're right that the fact that the monster is a creeper, right, who's doing all the things that society says are bad, and therefore he is monster, right? That's a very compelling case.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of the discussion on this film kind of gets lost in like, I mean, it is very otherworldly and abstract and like campy. I mean, and all of those things are true, and I think that often narrows the discussion into using the overly simplistic terms and ways and things that the film presents, and that is how the film is discussed in those overly simplistic manner. But I just don't, like you were saying, I just don't think that does the film itself justice.
So if we take, for example, the character of Nancy's father, played by John Saxon, who, plays a father-like figure in a lot of horror, like Black Christmas, this is just that story arc alone perfectly illustrates your point. So on the one hand, we can read it as this being a tale that the reason that Nancy has to be punished, or the reason that Nancy is punished, is because her family has let the properly working form of patriarchy fail, right? Like, it is her parents' fault, because if her mom had just been a better mother, wife, and if her dad had just been a better father, husband, then patriarchy, which would work otherwise, right, would work, and she would survive. And we see that a lot through this narrative of parental, particularly fatherly neglect. However, I think that the film also allows us to read it as making this argument that maybe the system that supports this idea of patriarchy, where we are dependent upon one member for a family to function, where our survival is built upon one person being able to do it all, be it all, and be, both strong and emotional and all these things, right? Maybe that's a system that is doomed to fail. And the film explores that just as much, right? Because if patriarchy had and the patriarchal system had worked, no child should have been molested in the first place. And so there's something really fascinating in the ways that this film, by kind of almost in its, and I mean this with like in an endearing way, but almost through its sloppiness, right? Through the gaps that it purposefully leaves in the narrative, we're able to again kind of grab onto different things, and the text allows for that. Again, going back to what you said, in a way that's very similar to Evil Dead.
Yeah, because I think it's just it's very disaffirmative in most systems that we have in place. It's clearly showing like that this slipped through the cracks. Like, law enforcement failed, and it fails consistently in this movie. They are never there on time. They never show up, even though the lieutenant is Nancy's father. So, like,
I know.
In theory, like, if there was ever gonna be like a person for whom the system worked, shouldn't it be the daughter of the lieutenant? But no, that's just how bad the system is. That you can't even protect your own child.
And multiple times, that narrative is carried through the explicit message that one of the most dangerous places to be is behind bars, right? So not only with Rod, but also with Nancy's mom, who, puts up the bars on the windows, right? Like, we've been taught that is a sign of protection, or systemic protection, and every time it is the cause of someone's death, because they're not able they're trapped, right? They're not able to escape.
Yeah, and I mean, doesn't the nightmare escape also serve as another prison? It's because you cannot escape from that either. Again, like, there are just so many layers of society and this, like, these systems that are in place that Nightmare is able to successfully tackle through kind of like, and I think the reason that it's able to be so disaffirmative and critique so many systems is because of the alienation that occurs by, like, oh no, it's not like, it's in a dream world. Oh, no, Freddy Krueger is just like this magic monster. Ooh-wee. Don't think about it too hard, guys.
Yeah.
But while you're not thinking about it, we're also going to critique everything.
Yeah. And the fact that it does all of that through horror comedy, I think, is really interesting, because I think that the difference is that a lot of horror comedy is comedy in which horrific elements are used to make us laugh, whereas I would say that let's see if I can say this right, that Nightmare is a horror film that uses comedic elements to terrify us, right? Because even though we're laughing at especially Robert Englund's performance as Freddy Krueger, which, let's face it, is a huge reason that the film works. It's not, we're not laughing in the same way as we do in films, in a lot of films, right? Like the comedy, it's not the horror that is momentarily inserted into the comedy, it's the comedy that's momentarily inserted into the horror, and that's a game changer in terms of horror comedy texts. The thing that makes me keep coming back to Nightmare, on top of the complexity that this film is and allows for, is definitely Robert Englund, but it's also the fact that, and we see this with Evil Dead as well, that beyond content, there are elements of form that are just so creative and so thoughtful that enhance the storyline and the narrative. And we've talked about a couple of them, but the other one that I don't think we can ignore is the bathroom scene, right? Which gets real phallic when the gloved knives are like right between Nancy's legs. But that scene, when she gets pulled down into the big thing of like what's like a lake of water. I mean, that's just so expertly done in the film.
Although not everybody agrees with you on that, because particularly when the film itself came out, like a lot of those elements, like Kim Newman from the British Film Institute said that the kissing telephone and bottomless bathtub are disorienting in a Cronenberg spirit. They get in the way of the relentless pursuing monster aspect that Carpenter manages so well. So not everyone agrees that some of those more disorienting, kind of ethereal, liminal elements that we think are so good are as effective. But I would probably say that's because I think that they're still trying to evaluate this film from the lens of a straightforward slasher, which, as we have said many, many times already in this episode, it is not.
There are a couple of things, though, that I think are my less favorite aspects of this film, and I will say that that compared to Jamie Lee Curtis's Laurie, I'm not as big of a fan of Heather Langenkamp's performance of Nancy. I don't know if I think she's the best actress, and to a degree that I think is occasionally a little laughable. But I also think that I mean,
have you seen her mother though? So like,
well, so
she's a product of her mom. I feel like she's.
Oh gosh, some of those scenes with Nancy's mom and drinking are cringeworthy in ways that are not entirely intended. So you're right. But with that said, first off, who am I to judge the acting of someone else? But second, she may not be perhaps always the most emotive actress, but she also creates a very memorable final girl. Nancy, you remember Nancy, and you remember her, and she's significant enough that she's come back time and again in the larger franchise.
I think it's a different style of acting than people are normally accustomed to in like film acting. It's far more akin to what I think you would see on like the stage. I think she's far more doing presentational style of acting that's more accustomed to something you might see like on the stage, in which the fourth wall doesn't exist. It's just sometimes you're like, that's a little too much. You really are just like doing a representation of that emotion, rather than the more like representational style of acting in which the fourth wall is up and you're really trying to like be in the moment. You're ignoring the fact that an audience will watch this at some point. She's not doing that, which is, I think, fine, because I don't think representational style of acting really would have fit the tone of this, but it is absolutely different.
And if we could make another comparison to Evil Dead, there's a mania present in both Ash and Nancy that I think is actually rather accurate for the trauma that they are experiencing. And when they're not in those manic moments, especially for Nancy, who's sleep deprived, right? Like she's robotic. So yeah, so some of it, I think, I mean, maybe it really means that she's the best actress I've ever seen. And that's just why I can't, I'm like, oh, is she even acting? But yeah, I think you've convinced me that even that is a detail that has its charm and certainly has a place within the film itself.
I know presentational versus representational I framed from acting standpoints, because those are like two generally accepted styles of acting that are used. But I think most of this movie falls under this presentational style. That is a note that you could use for everything, because it is a presentation. They're like, all right, audience, we know you're here. We know you're going to react. Look at this presentation. It's not real life. It is a presentation of a real-like environment, but we're going to really experiment and see what we can do in this insane presentational world that we've created.
What you just talked about, this like willingness to go there and see what happens. I think that when I look through the horror films that have resonated with me the most, that is a defining feature. That I think that it is not possible to have something be effective horror if you're going to play it safe. And not just in terms of like the formulas that we get presented with or the tropes or things like that, but also in terms of stylistic elements and the incorporation of soundscapes and things like that. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely correct that Nightmare on Elm Street remains a film that's worth talking about because it made itself be a film worth talking about. It took risks that didn't always maybe pay off for everyone, but that you certainly are going to be haunted by. And that's the point of good horror, I think. Above and beyond issues of affirmative or disaffirmative is that it should linger in your head, and you can never not be affected by it in a way that will stick with you forever. We hope that you enjoyed our discussion of Nightmare on Elm Street, because we're going to work our way through, much like we did with the Evil Dead, although much longer because there's so many more of them, the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And so we'll kind of introduce them periodically in through our rotation of other films and texts. So, and there are how many?
Depending on which ones you include, because some people don't include the remake, and so I mean there's about 10. It's either 9, you either think there's 9 or there are 10.
Okay, and we'll go through all of them because I think that it will be cathartic to casually and systematically destroy the remake. And there's a couple good things, but mainly, yeah. So this will be the journey you will be going on with us for a while now. However, our next episode is actually going to be on...
it's A Tale of Two Shinings. We're going to be talking about the 1977 original novel by Stephen King, and then the 1980 film by Stanley Kubrick.
And every so often I'll mention the delightfully horrible or horribly delightful made-for-TV miniseries.
That one's by King.
Yes, by Stephen King and Mick Garris, who is a longtime collaborator. So, but I still think it deserves to be thrown in there. But The Story of Two Shinings is a much better title. So we hope that you will join us for that episode. And in the meantime,
be sure to subscribe to our podcast and also follow all of our social medias, which are linked in the description. And be sure to, if you could, just give us a like wherever you get your podcast from and write us a review. That really helps. And share us with your friends. Have a great day. Thanks for listening.